Hi, guys. I can't believe it's time for our next episode. Great to see you both. How are you doing?
Really good, thank you.
Yeah, hi Nat. Yeah, I have to say the week passes by really quickly, doesn't it? I'm not surprised that it's going by quickly for you. I was watching you over the weekend. You looked as though you were really busy.
Yeah, I was. But when you spend a week sort of in the business, out on the road with the BFA Legal Seminar that took place last Tuesday, I must say I was ready for some exercise on the weekend. So
I bet you were.
Brilliant.
It looked as though the legal seminar was really well attended.
Well, it was actually sold out, and I think, to be fair,
Wow.
they were sort of having to put extra chairs in the room. Yes, it was great. I mean, obviously, it's the sort of one day of the year that the BFA brings all the lawyers together. But I think for franchisors, it's an absolute no-brainer because for the cost of attending that seminar, you get an update on sort of all things legal and things that have happened in the previous 12 months, things to be aware of, and the topics were really very good. So, and it's an opportunity to sort of corner a couple of lawyers and get to chat to them for free without getting a bill.
I was going to say they're not on the clock, right? They haven't hit the clock.
Yeah. No, but it was really great. There was some really great takeaways and some very good presentations. And we covered things, everything from, like, say, regulatory update, case law update, and sort of running through, going back. Vicky covered sort of recruitment and BFA code of ethics and sort of best practice with that. Then John Pratt talked about marketing fund. There was some fantastic discussions about on sort of from our litigators, and Russell gave an update on the mediation scheme that's being updated at the moment and will be rolled out very soon, which I'm particularly excited about, to be honest with you, because I think that is also such a that's such a good way to resolve disputes, and the fact that BFA offers that scheme to its members and actually potentially non-members is brilliant.
So how does it work, the BFA mediation scheme then?
Well, we'll have to wait for the full detail, but essentially, if you have a dispute, franchisor-franchisee dispute, you can take it to mediation, and the BFA mediation scheme essentially is very cost effective, and you will get a mediator who is an experienced mediator and is familiar with franchising. So you're sort of really getting both of those elements in one, which again, by far mediation is the best way to resolve disputes. I mean, there are exceptional circumstances where action is necessary, but
I've heard you talk about that before, that you never really nobody really wants to end up in court. It doesn't really help anyone, does it? It's just tie so much emotional energy, and it's
Well, and that's a good point, Kevin, because actually I think a lot of people sort of forget about that element, the fact that it takes time, but the fact that it takes an emotional toll. And as with any dispute, it's I think when you're a party to the dispute, it can be really, really hard to take that step out and see it from sort of from a removed standpoint. And that's where mediation can be so effective, because the whole point of the mediator is essentially to try and move that dial from sort of being here to being a little bit more towards the middle. But the other bit, and I've seen that in practice as well, is when you've got an outcome that is reached by the parties, that they both come to together and they commit to it, it's so much stronger than any judgment that's imposed by a third party. So that's number one. And number two, in mediation, the options for a resolution and what can be part of that resolution are so much wider, because essentially in court you sort of, you get a judgment, and it's either, it's often sort of monetary judgment or something like that, whereas in mediation there are other options for what that looks like and what resolution looks like, and that is not necessarily always about the money. And I think that's the point. It's not always about the money.
Sure.
As you say, whether you win in court or not, you can still lose in the court public opinion and in the press, and so on as well. So it's more than, reputational risk. It's not just the financial risk and so on, as all that reputational risk as well.
Yeah, and I think what I was going to say was, what I could hear from you, Nat, is that the potential for bringing people closer together with mediation, rather than driving them apart through a court-led litigation, is much better. It can get very nasty when you not only is it financially challenging and the time that it takes, but it just drives people apart. And if you can bring people together, that has to be a better outcome.
Yeah, you're right. I think the whole sort of process, it's almost, because you have to defend your point, and then you have to accuse the other side. I think the whole process, as you say, is really about polarizing those opinions, whereas mediation is all about, it really is all about, let's try and find a resolution. What does that look like? What's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? What does compromise look like? And it can be so different. And it's accepting that actually with litigation comes uncertainty. And again and again, we see that play out in courts. And you sort of think that, that case should never have ended up in court, and yet it does. And often the party who thinks that they've got a bulletproof case actually sometimes loses, and that can be hard to swallow.
It becomes all public knowledge, and everybody's dirty washing is hung out to dry.
Exactly, because it's public, right? And again, mediation is confidential. So you can really, you can walk away with dignity of having reached a resolution and sort of kept that out of public eye.
Kevin, I think you came up with some news on the legal front this last week.
Yeah, so I don't know if you guys saw this, but the government published the top list of offenders, so people are basically paying less than the minimum wage. And obviously, I'm not going to name names, but there were definitely some franchise brands on there. So it was interesting. It's a bit of a shame, really, to see some well-known franchise brands on there. Did you guys have a chance to look at that?
Clearly, franchisees, I wouldn't expect franchisors at all to be advocating below minimum wage. But it is, in today's world, you just wonder, first of all, why would independent business people be doing that? Because it certainly wouldn't be part of a franchise brand's operations manual or KPIs or anything like that. But it's certainly something. I hadn't seen the list before, to be honest. Call me somebody who's got my head in the sand. I don't know. But again, I guess, Nat, you've seen that list before.
Yeah, I've not looked at this just now, but certainly, absolutely. When I was in house, it's something that I used to check and look at, because from my perspective, if you're a franchisor, it's one of those things that obviously, if a franchisee doesn't comply with national minimum wage, that's a breach. That's a breach of the franchise agreement, because the franchise agreement would require you to comply with all of the laws, and that's a legal requirement. So it is a real shame to see franchise brands on there. But and it's an action point for franchisors to take away, really, that it should be part of something, part of their checklist of something that they look at as part of their audit of their franchisees, because you know that it's coming out, when it gets published. And certainly for me, it would be a point, as a franchisor, I'd be making a note of that, and I'd be picking up the phone and getting that franchisee, on the line and saying what is going on. because that shouldn't be happening.
The list is a government released document, which is a naming and shaming document, really. For anybody in the public eye who is flicking through that, who doesn't fully understand the franchising model, they see XYZ brand, which is well known, and they understandably assume that brand is guilty across the entire brand, when in reality it is only an individual franchisee which has been named. So vitally important for the brand to be on top of that completely, because it doesn't do their brand image any good.
Exactly. And that's exactly the point, that obviously, being part of a franchise setup, if you have one franchisee who's non-compliant, or one franchisee that does something, bad, that has a knock-on effect on, potentially the whole network. But that, and that is the big difference. So the big difference between licensing and franchising is about having those standards. And so as a franchisor, you have to have a process for how you check those standards, how you enforce those standards. So being a franchisor is not just about giving somebody that business model. It's not just about providing the support, but actually there is that other element to being a franchisor, which is about auditing, and which is about checking compliance and making sure that you take appropriate action if somebody is non-compliant. Because the danger that if you don't, that obviously devalues the brand. So all that hard work that you've done in creating the brand, in building it up, in starting to franchise, and we all know how tough it is in the early days. So all that hard work can be so quickly undone by then not enforcing the standards, not seeing them through, and not taking action against those franchisees who break the rules.
So, quick question to you guys. I used to work in the oil industry, very large, well-known oil company, and we were like totally indoctrinated in the whole idea of risk management and assessing risks and identifying risks early, and not just safety risks, but reputational risks as well. So, to what extent do you feel that franchising has that kind of mindset? Did franchisors sit down and actively say, what are the risks that let's take? I was at the CAA conference, Children's Activity Association conference, and they are very, very proactive about encouraging their members to be very ethical in terms of child protection, but B, there's this whole sense of not only do we have to be really good, but what happens if something goes wrong? How do we manage that risk as well? To what extent do you see franchisors having that kind of mindset?
Interesting question.
Tim?
I guess really interesting. I mean, I'm sure Nat will be able to give a perspective on that. I think when you've got situations where you've got associations and you've got the franchisor, so the tuition industry is very similar to that you've got the Tutors Association and you've got franchisors. So franchisors will have their standards and their compliance and all of that, safety, but then that could be very often strengthened by being a member of the trade association. Very similar to franchisors belonging to the BFA as well. So you by belonging to the BFA, you comply with their ethical standards. You have to maintain your standards within that framework. And I think that within franchising, franchisors who belong to their own sector trade bodies and are then led by those standards as well, or at least their standards can be enhanced by their trade body led standards. I think that answers your query, Kevin.
Yeah, just to add to what Tim was saying, I think My experience, and I obviously can only speak from my experience. I don't know all franchisors, and I don't know everybody's attitude to it. I think industries who are regulated, there's probably that extra element, and they're probably more. I'd expect them to sort of to be more focused on, be more aware of compliance. Yeah, because you've got this extra body that regulates you, and also industries who are working with either, for example, children or the elderly, or where there is a human element of a service, I guess, because naturally there are higher risks flowing from that. Then again, I think risk management and risk assessment will probably come up higher from perhaps those businesses where it's sort of more retail and more goods only, which are not necessarily that harmful. But again, yeah, we've seen that. We saw that that instance when in Pret case, when with that allergic reaction, the girl suffered an allergic reaction, and the effect that had, how quickly that sort of hit the media, and I'm sure Pret probably lost some business on the back of that. But I think for any franchisor, brand management and reputational damage should be very, very high on the agenda, because to me, it always comes back to your brand is one of your absolutely essential, one of the main assets that you have as a franchisor. That franchisees are paying a fee to be renting that brand, to be renting your name. So that's a huge asset that you should be protecting. And frankly, if you're not doing enough, then I'd be saying, you're not perhaps doing a great job as a franchisor. That should be very high on the agenda, because that's your job to protect the brand.
Yeah. So that's led me to two thoughts. One is brands, especially emerging brands, smaller brands. Do you have crisis management processes in place for your franchise network, especially if you are a brand which is a service which is dealing with vulnerable people, the elderly, children, etc., etc. And I've been in a situation before where there has been a challenge, and it's if you haven't got that in place, if the press are onto what's going on before you know where you are as a franchisor, you've got them at your front door, you've got them phoning you, and you've got to be prepared for those eventualities. And the other one, which we never really speak about because it is, it's never going to happen to me, is data breaches. Every single franchisor that I know of is using some kind of CRM system which is based in the cloud. And that's got not only their franchisees' personal data on, it's got all the franchisees' customers' personal data on. And have franchisors considered what happens when they get hacked by somebody who says, we've got all your data, here's a ransom note? And because that's what's happening, is that these a lot of these data, as I'm sure you probably both know, but there's an industry out there of unreported data hacks which are feeding the criminal gangs just by ransoms. And you pay the ransom and they release your data back to you. Are franchisors aware of that? I presume there's insurance to cover it. In fact, I know that there should be insurance to cover it, but have they got that insurance in place? Have they got strong enough data compliances in place to make it as robust as possible?
Well, I mean, we only have about 10 minutes left, and I could literally talk about this topic for hours. But
Go on.
I'm very passionate about data protection. And I did a lot of work. Obviously, when we had the change from, when GDPR was being rolled out and coming into force. I do genuinely think that because with data protection, there often isn't a black and white answer to any question, because so much depends on circumstances, etc. And because it is seen by many as very dry and very boring, that some franchisors just don't want to deal with that, and they kind of don't see it very high on their priority list. There are some franchisors who see the importance of it, and those who do, invest in it and put, actually prioritize that and actually support their network, because again, also, you're only as good as your weakest link, right? And if your network don't really know what they're doing and don't have the processes in place, then you are exposed. Insurance is all good, but it comes back to the reputational damage. And whilst insurance can help with the immediate aftermath and some of the sort of recovery of costs, perhaps, that are that can absolutely skyrocket once when there is a data breach, it's the reputational damage that can be very, very hard to control, because depending on what data gets out and depending on type of data that it is, again, you're talking potentially about vulnerable individuals, and anything can happen. So the risks are so high, and it's definitely data protection is something I bring up with my clients all the time, because I think it's such an essential part, again, of you have so much data. Our world today, data is valuable. It's a hugely valuable asset. And actually, if we don't have the right processes in place to protect that, and our technology, is not robust enough, or our processes are not robust enough, even as simple as educating people about what is a data breach, because a lot of the time, what I have discovered is people don't actually know don't often realize what a data breach is. And it's sort of going back to the basics, and really not just educating the franchisor, the franchise owner, but actually educating your frontline staff, because you have to think about who is using the data on a day-to-day basis. And if that's your employees in the field, then actually the most important part is making sure they know what they should or shouldn't be doing, and following the processes. Because if something happens, it can be really, really hugely damaging.
So these all sound like good questions, really, for potential franchisees to be, not particularly sexy questions, because they're all the kind of the other stuff that isn't the kind of core business of the franchise, but all good questions to be asking franchisors about, like, well, what's your reputational risk management policy, or what's your what's your crisis management strategy? Like, is the franchisor on this stuff? Because if some other franchisee is going to, as we've seen, somebody else doing something wrong can really affect me and my business through no fault of my own.
Yeah, and Kevin, the interesting bit for me is always, when prospective franchisees look at a franchise agreement, and often, if they look at the franchise agreement, and they'll see it as being very restrictive, which, of course, it is, and it should be. And sometimes they'll get a comment like, "Oh, it's very one-sided." Yes, it should be, but they very often don't consider the viewpoint of, it is there to protect. It is there like that. It looks like that to protect me, because if I'm buying into this system, the same restrictions apply to all the other franchisees, right? So actually, if it is restrictive, that is to my benefit as a franchisee, because then I know that other franchisees are subject to the same restrictions. Actually, if I was a franchisee signing on the dotted line and the agreement was, not so restrictive, I'd be thinking, well, yeah, I've got all this freedom, but that means others have just the same amount of freedom, and who knows what my neighbor might be doing. So you kind of always have to look at that and think it's there for a reason, and actually it protects me.
Totally.
Yeah, it's a good point, Nat. Perhaps that needs to come into that conversation up front, right? As we're starting to talk to franchisors, it's a frightening thought, I have to say, talking to potential franchisees about the restrictiveness of the franchise agreement. So when you do get to see it, don't be put off by it, because that's what normally happens. So they've got eyes wide open, and there's a good, solid reason for it. Maybe a discussion for another time, because it could open up a bit of a can of worms or something, but which is understandable. But so often new franchisees are excited about the prospect of joining the franchise. Then they get presented with the franchise agreement. Then they go, oh my goodness. And then they take it to not a franchise lawyer, their family solicitor, and he says, you can't accept anything in this, get it all changed. Perhaps if they had some kind of eyes wide open, they'd fully understand why the agreement was built in that way. I don't know. Look, that's been a really good conversation. Wasn't expecting it to go in that direction today. Actually, we all seem to have great chats, the three of us, and I've certainly learned something. And one thing which I would like to say is hats off to the BFA for putting. Obviously, these seminars are becoming more and more popular, and I know they happen on an annual basis. But it seems to me a lot of goodwill has come out of, especially last week's seminar, and probably the one before that as well. Yes, if it was standing room only, then they're going to, the BFA is going to have to think about putting on bigger events by the looks, which is great. The things are the franchise community is seeing real value in that membership.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? It's really nice to see that it's on people's agenda, and actually, because obviously, I think for us, it's all about delivering stuff that actually is useful to franchisors. But seeing franchisors turning up and seeing how engaged everyone is in conversations, that always is just, that's brilliant. So yeah, we've got the rest of the year to look forward to. So, but yeah, now I think my dog is barking as well. So it's definitely time to wrap this up. Great to see you all. And yeah, and I can't wait till our next session.